The night began with silence so heavy it felt like a verdict already spoken. A man sat inside a cramped shack, staring at a life that no longer made sense. His name was David Okoye, once respected, now reduced to uncertainty and regret. Outside, the world of the village continued without him, loud and indifferent. Children laughed in the distance, vendors called out prices, and music drifted through dusty air. Inside, the small room felt frozen, as if time had stopped only for him. David's hands were clasped tightly together, resting on his knees as he fought his thoughts. He remembered when his voice carried confidence, when people listened, when he walked with purpose and pride. Now even his reflection felt unfamiliar and distant. The shack itself told a quiet story of collapse and endurance. A cracked table leaned unevenly near the wall, a thin mattress lay folded in the corner, and rusted metal sheets struggled to block the heat. Every object felt like a reminder of something once whole. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself, but the air only felt heavier. There had been a time when mornings meant opportunity, when ambition guided every step he took. That version of him felt like a stranger now, buried under loss and silence. The door creaked open gently, and a woman entered carrying a small tray of food. Her name was Diana, his wife, the woman who had once believed in him when no one else did. Sweat lined her forehead, yet her expression remained calm and steady. She placed the food down without complaint, her movements careful and practiced. Diana had become the foundation of their survival, working tirelessly each morning to keep them alive. Her small food business was the reason they still had anything to eat at all. David looked at her with quiet shame, noticing how she never let exhaustion break her spirit. She had stood by him through failure, giving her last savings when hope was all they had left. In that moment, something unspoken hung between them, fragile but unbroken. Morning arrived with a pale, uncertain light spilling over the village. The air was cooler than the night before, yet it carried a strange tension, as if the world itself was waiting for something to break. David Okoye sat awake long before sunrise, staring at the uneven ceiling of the shack. Sleep had come in fragments, filled with memories of who he used to be. Each memory felt like a wound reopening without warning. Diana moved quietly around the small space, preparing for another day of work. Her hands were steady, though her body showed exhaustion she never complained about. She tied her wrapper tightly, ready to face the heat outside again. The smell of yesterday's firewood still lingered faintly in the air. Outside, the village slowly awakened, voices rising, footsteps gathering, life continuing without hesitation. Inside, everything felt slower, heavier, more fragile. David finally stood, adjusting his worn shirt as if trying to prepare himself for something invisible. He had no destination, no clear purpose, only the weight of thoughts he could not escape. Every movement felt uncertain, measured and hesitant. Diana glanced at him briefly while placing a tray near the door. Her expression softened, carrying both concern and quiet determination. She had learned how to survive silence, even when it hurt more than words. "You should eat before you go," she said gently, her voice calm but firm. David nodded without argument, though his appetite was gone. He picked at the food slowly, as if each bite reminded him of something lost. Diana watched him carefully, noticing how distant he had become. He no longer spoke about the future, nor did he carry the same fire in his eyes. Something inside him had shifted, though she could not yet name it. After eating, David stepped outside, squinting at the rising sun. The road ahead looked the same as always, dusty and uneven, yet today it felt unfamiliar. He walked without direction, unsure of what he was searching for. The village was alive with movement, but none of it belonged to him anymore. He passed familiar faces that no longer seemed to recognize his presence. Each step carried a silent question he could not answer. Diana remained at the doorway, watching him disappear into the distance. A quiet worry settled in her chest, but she pushed it down, reminding herself to stay strong. She had carried fear before and survived it. Later that morning, she prepared her small food stall with practiced efficiency. The stall was modest, built from wood and patched fabric, yet it was her lifeline. She called out to early customers with a warm, steady voice. "Hot food ready," she announced, her tone carrying both energy and resilience. People gathered slowly, drawn by the smell and familiarity. For a brief moment, life felt normal again, even comforting in its routine. But even while serving customers, her thoughts drifted back to David. She remembered when they once dreamed together, when struggle felt temporary and hope felt permanent. Those memories now felt distant, almost unreal. As the sun rose higher, the heat became harsh and unforgiving. Diana wiped sweat from her face, continuing her work without pause. Her strength came not from ease, but from necessity and love she still held quietly. That afternoon, a small incident at the stall disrupted her rhythm. A customer questioned her pricing harshly, his tone dismissive and loud. Diana responded calmly, though her hands trembled slightly under pressure. She kept her composure, refusing to let frustration take control. The crowd eventually moved on, but the moment lingered in her mind longer than expected. It reminded her how fragile stability could be. When evening approached, she packed up slowly, exhaustion pressing into her bones. The sky turned orange and gold, casting long shadows across the village paths. Each step home felt heavier than the last. David was already back when she arrived, sitting in silence near the doorway again. His posture was unchanged, but his eyes looked more distant than before. Something about him felt further away than in the morning. Diana placed the food beside him without speaking at first. Then she finally asked softly if anything had happened during his walk. David hesitated, then simply shook his head, avoiding her gaze. The silence between them stretched longer than usual that night. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying whispers of change neither of them understood yet. Inside, something unspoken began to form quietly between husband and wife, fragile and uncertain. The next morning arrived with a strange heaviness hanging in the air. Clouds drifted low over the village, dimming the sunlight and casting soft grey shadows across the dusty roads. Everything felt quieter than usual, as if the world was holding its breath. David Okoye woke early again, though sleep had offered him little comfort. He sat on the edge of the thin mattress, staring at his hands as if searching for answers written in his own skin. His thoughts were restless, looping through memories he could not escape. Diana was already moving through the small space, preparing herself for another long day. She tied her wrapper tightly and adjusted her blouse, her movements calm but deliberate. There was no complaint in her expression, only endurance shaped by necessity. The smell of smoke from nearby cooking fires drifted into the shack, mixing with the cool morning air. Outside, the village was slowly coming alive again, voices rising faintly in the distance. Life continued its rhythm, indifferent to personal struggles. David finally stood and stepped outside, pausing at the doorway. The road ahead looked familiar, yet it no longer felt like his own path. He hesitated for a moment before walking forward without direction. Diana watched him leave, her eyes following his figure until it disappeared into the distance. A quiet worry settled inside her chest, though she refused to let it grow into fear. She had learned to survive uncertainty. Later, she arrived at her small food stall and began setting up with practiced speed. The wooden table, the cooking pot, and the simple umbrella shade were her entire world during the day. She greeted early customers with a warm, steady voice. The morning crowd was small but consistent. Familiar faces came and went, exchanging brief words and small smiles. For a while, the routine gave her comfort, something predictable to hold on to. Yet her thoughts kept drifting back to David. She remembered how he once spoke with confidence, how he once carried dreams like they were certain promises. That version of him felt distant now, almost unreachable. As the day grew warmer, the heat pressed down heavily on the stall. Diana continued working without slowing, her hands moving quickly, her mind divided between duty and concern. Every coin she earned felt harder than before. A passing conversation between customers caught her attention briefly. They spoke about opportunities in the nearby town, about jobs and interviews that promised change. Diana listened quietly while continuing her work. Something about the conversation lingered in her mind. She did not fully understand why, but a small sense of possibility stirred within her thoughts. She pushed it aside, focusing instead on serving the next customer. Meanwhile, David wandered through the village streets without clear purpose. He passed places he once knew well, yet none of them felt familiar anymore. Each step seemed disconnected from the life he used to live. He stopped near a small gathering of men talking under a tree. Their laughter felt distant to him, as if it belonged to another world entirely. He stood there for a moment, then turned away without speaking. By late afternoon, clouds thickened again, threatening rain that never fully arrived. The air grew heavier, and the streets began to empty slowly. Diana packed up her stall earlier than usual, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her arms. As she walked home, she noticed how the sky reflected her mood, uncertain and dim. Every step carried the burden of unspoken thoughts about David and their future. She wished for clarity but found only questions. When she arrived, David was already sitting in the same position as before, silent and still. His expression had not changed, but something in his eyes felt even more distant than the day before. Diana placed the food beside him quietly. They shared a long silence that evening, one that neither of them knew how to break. Outside, the wind moved gently through the village, brushing against the fragile calm of their lives. Inside, the feeling of change continued to grow without a name. The morning broke slowly over the village, spilling pale light across the rooftops and dusty paths. A soft mist lingered in the air, giving everything a muted, uncertain glow. It felt like the world itself was still deciding how to begin the day. David Okoye woke before anyone else, as he had begun doing every morning. Sleep no longer brought rest, only fragmented thoughts and restless memories. He sat quietly, listening to the sounds of distant life unfolding outside. Diana was already preparing to leave, tying her wrapper with careful precision. Her movements were steady, but her eyes carried a quiet fatigue she never spoke about. She paused briefly, glancing at David as if trying to read his silence. He avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the floor beneath him. Something between them had changed, though neither had spoken it aloud. It lingered in their shared silence, growing slowly like an invisible wall. Outside, the village was alive with early activity. Vendors arranged their goods, children ran along narrow paths, and voices rose in familiar rhythms. Life continued without pause, indifferent to the wait inside their home. David stepped outside shortly after Diana left. The air felt cooler than expected, brushing against his skin like a reminder of time passing. He walked slowly, without direction, his thoughts scattered and unfocused. As he moved through the village, he noticed how people interacted around him. Conversations paused briefly when he passed, then resumed as if nothing had changed. He felt invisible in spaces that once knew him well. Diana reached her food stall and began setting up with practiced efficiency. The wooden structure creaked softly under the morning breeze, but it remained stable. She greeted familiar customers with a calm voice that masked her inner tension. Business started slowly, then gradually picked up as the sun rose higher. The smell of fried food filled the air, drawing people from nearby streets. For a few hours, she lost herself in routine and movement. Still, her thoughts returned repeatedly to David. She remembered the man he used to be, full of purpose and certainty. The contrast between then and now weighed heavily on her heart, though she never spoke of it aloud. Meanwhile, David stopped near a small roadside gathering. Men were discussing opportunities in a nearby town, their voices filled with energy and hope. He stood at a distance, listening without joining. Their words about work and interviews lingered in his mind longer than expected. For a brief moment, something stirred within him, faint but noticeable. Then it faded, replaced by doubt and hesitation. By midday, the sun had grown harsh, pressing down on the village with relentless heat. Diana continued serving customers, wiping sweat from her forehead between orders. Her strength remained steady, though her body grew tired. A brief argument broke out between two customers over change at her stall. Diana intervened calmly, resolving the issue with quiet authority. Once again, she maintained order in the small world she controlled. As afternoon approached, clouds began forming in the distance, dark and heavy. The air shifted, carrying the scent of possible rain that never fully arrived. The village grew quieter as people retreated indoors. Diana packed her stall earlier than usual, her exhaustion deeper than she admitted. Each step toward home felt heavier, as if carrying more than just physical weight. Her thoughts remained tangled in silence and uncertainty. David was already home when she arrived, sitting in his usual position near the doorway. His posture had not changed, but his expression seemed more distant than before. The silence between them felt thicker this time. Diana placed the food down and hesitated before speaking. David responded with a short, unclear answer, avoiding her eyes. The distance between them remained unspoken but deeply felt. That night, as darkness settled over the village, neither of them found comfort in conversation. The wind moved gently through the cracks of the shack, carrying quiet reminders of change already underway. Inside, their shared silence continued to grow heavier, marking the beginning of something neither fully understood. The fifth morning arrived with a different kind of silence, one that felt deeper and more uncertain than before. The sky was clearer, yet the air carried a heaviness that pressed quietly on everything below it. Even the sounds of the village seemed softened, as if muted by unseen tension. David Okoye woke earlier than usual, though he had barely slept at all. His mind felt crowded, filled with thoughts that refused to settle. He sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the ground as though searching for meaning in its stillness. Diana was already awake, preparing herself for another day at the stall. Her movements were careful, controlled, almost mechanical. She tied her wrapper tightly, adjusted her blouse, and quietly gathered her things. The space between them felt different that morning. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably present. It was the kind of distance that grew silently, without warning, until it could no longer be ignored. Outside, the village began its usual rhythm. Roosters crowed, vendors called out, and footsteps filled the narrow paths. Life continued in its familiar pattern, untouched by the tension growing inside their home. David stepped outside without speaking much. The air felt warmer now, the sun already climbing higher than expected. He walked slowly, unsure of where he was going or what he was hoping to find. Diana watched him leave, her expression steady but her thoughts unsettled. She wanted to speak, to ask something, anything that could bridge the growing silence between them. But the words never came. At her stall, Diana began her day as she always did, setting out her simple tools and lighting the fire beneath her pot. The smell of frying food soon filled the air, attracting early customers from nearby streets. Her voice remained warm and welcoming as she served each person. Yet behind her calm exterior, her mind was restless. She kept thinking about David, about the changes she could not fully understand. A few regular customers noticed her quietness and asked if everything was fine. Diana smiled and nodded, offering polite reassurance, but her heart carried questions she could not share. Meanwhile, David found himself near the outskirts of the village. He stopped under a large tree where a group of men were gathered, discussing work opportunities in a nearby town. Their voices carried excitement and urgency. He listened from a distance, not joining, only observing. Something about their energy stirred a faint memory of who he used to be. For a moment, he felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost. But as quickly as it came, the feeling faded. Doubt returned, heavier than before, wrapping itself around his thoughts. He turned away slowly, continuing his walk without direction. By midday, the heat intensified, pressing down on the village with unforgiving force. Diana wiped sweat from her face repeatedly, refusing to slow down. Her hands moved quickly, but her mind remained divided. A small incident occurred at the stall when a customer questioned the portion size. Diana responded calmly, maintaining her composure despite the rising tension. The situation ended quickly, but it left her emotionally drained. As afternoon approached, the sky shifted again. Clouds gathered in the distance, dark and slow-moving, hinting at rain that might never come. The village grew quieter as people retreated from the heat. Diana closed her stall earlier than usual and began the walk home. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from physical exhaustion alone, but from the weight of unspoken concerns. Her thoughts kept returning to David. When she arrived home, David was already there, sitting in the same familiar position. His eyes were fixed on nothing in particular, distant and unreadable. The silence between them felt even thicker than before. Diana placed the food down gently and sat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt small, filled with everything they were not saying. That night, the wind moved softly through the cracks of the shack. It carried with it a sense of change that neither of them could name. Inside, David and Diana sat in silence, each lost in thoughts they could no longer share. The sixth morning arrived with a pale, washed-out sky stretching over the village. The air felt still, almost suspended, as if the world had paused between one breath and the next. Even the usual morning sounds seemed distant and subdued. David Okoye woke with the same heaviness he had carried for days. Sleep no longer refreshed him, it only blurred the edges of his thoughts. He sat in silence, staring at nothing, lost in a slow current of reflection. Diana was already preparing to leave, her routine unchanged but her presence quieter than before. She tied her wrapper, adjusted her blouse, and moved with careful precision. Yet something in her eyes had begun to shift. The distance between them had grown into something unspoken but undeniable. It was no longer just silence. It was separation forming in real time. Neither of them knew how to stop it or even how to name it. Outside, the village began its usual rhythm. Vendors shouted softly into the morning air. Children ran barefoot along dusty paths, and smoke rose from cooking fires. Life continued, steady and indifferent. David stepped outside without a clear destination. The road ahead stretched uneven and dusty, leading nowhere specific. He walked slowly, as though each step required more effort than the last. Diana watched him leave again, her gaze lingering longer this time. She wanted to call out, to ask him to stay, or at least to explain what was happening between them, but her voice stayed trapped inside her. At her stall, Diana resumed her work, lighting the fire and preparing her pots. The familiar smell of frying food filled the air, drawing early customers. Her hands moved quickly, but her mind remained unsettled. Customers arrived steadily, offering brief greetings and small conversations. Diana responded with practiced warmth, yet her smile felt thinner than before. Something behind her eyes carried quiet strain. A woman at the stall noticed her distraction and asked if everything was all right. Diana nodded gently, insisting she was fine. But the truth sat heavier inside her than she allowed herself to admit. Meanwhile, David found himself once again near the outskirts of the village. A group of men were gathered under a tree, speaking with urgency about work opportunities and travel possibilities. Their voices carried hope and direction. He stood at a distance, listening without joining. Their energy felt foreign yet familiar, like a memory of a life he had once lived. For a brief moment, something stirred within him. That flicker of possibility was quickly overshadowed by doubt. He turned away before it could grow, choosing silence over uncertainty. His feet carried him forward without purpose. By midday, the sun burned heavily over the village, pressing down on everything without mercy. Diana continued working through the heat, wiping sweat from her face between customers. Her endurance remained steady, though her spirit felt increasingly burdened. A small disagreement broke out at the stall over change, briefly disrupting the flow of customers. Diana handled it calmly, restoring order with quiet authority. Yet the moment left a lingering fatigue in her chest. As the afternoon advanced, clouds gathered again in the distance. They were dark and slow-moving, promising rain that never seemed to fully arrive. The village began to quiet under the thickening sky. Diana closed her stall earlier than usual and began her walk home. The path felt longer than it should have, each step weighted with unspoken thoughts. Her mind kept returning to David and the silence between them. When she arrived, David was already seated in his familiar place near the doorway. His posture had not changed, but his presence felt even more distant than before. The air between them was heavier now. Diana placed the food down and sat quietly across from him. Neither spoke at first. The silence stretched, deep and unresolved, filling every corner of the small shack. That night, as the wind brushed softly through the village, both of them remained lost in their own thoughts. The silence between David and Diana was no longer just absence of words. It had become a quiet transformation neither could yet understand. The seventh morning arrived with a dull grey light pressing softly over the village. The sky looked uncertain, neither fully cloudy nor clear, as if reflecting the unsettled lives beneath it. A quiet tension lingered in the air. David Okoye woke earlier than the sun, as had become his habit. Sleep no longer offered escape, only fragments of thought that followed him into waking. He sat still for a long time, listening to nothing but his own breath. Diana was already moving through the small space, preparing for another day. Her routine remained unchanged, but her energy felt different now, slightly more restrained. She moved carefully, as though trying not to disturb the fragile balance between them. The silence between husband and wife had deepened further. It was no longer just absence of conversation, it had become something heavier, something that filled the room even when neither spoke. Outside, the village stirred to life. Vendors arranged their goods, smoke rose from cooking fires, and voices carried through narrow paths. Everything continued as always, indifferent to the quiet tension inside their home. David stepped outside without speaking, pausing briefly at the doorway. The air felt heavier today, as if the atmosphere itself carried unspoken pressure. He began walking slowly, without direction or purpose. Diana watched him leave, her expression calm but her thoughts unsettled. She had begun to notice small changes that worried her more than she admitted. The distance between them was no longer subtle. At her stall, Diana set up her cooking space with steady hands. The fire crackled softly beneath her pot, and the familiar scent of food filled the air. Customers began to arrive, bringing brief moments of distraction. She greeted them with warmth, maintaining her usual composure. Yet her eyes often drifted away, as if searching for something beyond the present moment. Her mind remained divided between duty and concern. A passing conversation between customers caught her attention. They spoke about new opportunities in a nearby town, mentioning interviews and companies expanding quickly. Diana listened quietly while continuing her work. The idea lingered in her mind longer than expected. She did not fully understand why, but something about it felt significant. She pushed the thought aside, focusing on the present moment. Meanwhile, David found himself again near the outskirts of the village. The group of men under the tree had grown slightly larger, their voices filled with energy and ambition. They spoke of leaving, of building something new elsewhere. He stood at a distance, listening without joining. Their confidence reminded him of a version of himself he barely recognized anymore. For a brief moment, he felt something stir within him. But that feeling faded quickly, replaced by doubt and hesitation. He turned away silently, continuing his walk without direction. Each step felt heavier than the last. By midday, the sun burned strongly over the village, pressing heat into every surface. Diana continued working, despite the exhaustion building in her body. Her hands moved quickly, her strength driven by necessity. A minor disagreement broke out at her stall over pricing, momentarily breaking the rhythm of her day. Diana resolved it calmly, her voice steady despite the strain she felt inside. The moment passed, but it left her drained. As afternoon approached, the sky shifted once again. Dark clouds gathered slowly in the distance, hinting at rain that might not arrive. The village grew quieter as people retreated indoors. Diana closed her stall earlier than usual and began her walk home. The path felt longer than it should have, each step carrying emotional weight she could not fully name. Her thoughts kept returning to David. When she arrived, David was already seated in his usual position. His posture was unchanged, but his presence felt more distant than ever before. The silence between them had become almost physical. Diana placed the food down and sat quietly across from him. Neither spoke for a long time. The room felt small, filled with everything they were no longer saying. That night, as the wind moved gently through the village, both remained awake in their own silence. Something was shifting between them, slowly and quietly, like a path dividing into two directions neither could yet see clearly. The eighth morning arrived with a strange stillness that felt heavier than usual. The sky was pale and stretched thin, with no clear promise of sun or rain. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move. David Okoye woke before dawn, as if his body no longer understood the need for rest. He sat quietly on the edge of the mattress, staring into space where thoughts gathered without order or relief. Diana was already preparing to leave, her movements controlled and quiet. She tied her wrapper carefully, adjusted her blouse, and avoided unnecessary noise. Something between them had shifted into a careful silence. The distance inside the small shack felt wider now, even though nothing physical had changed. It was as if their shared space had begun to divide itself into two invisible worlds. Outside, the village slowly came alive. The usual sounds of morning returned, vendors calling, children running, smoke rising from cooking fires. Life continued as it always did, unaffected. David stepped outside without speaking. He paused for a moment, looking down the familiar dusty road. It no longer felt like a path leading anywhere meaningful. Still, he walked. Diana watched him leave, her expression steady but her thoughts heavy. She no longer tried to understand the silence, she only observed it growing. A quiet sadness settled inside her. At her stall, she resumed her routine with practiced efficiency. The fire was lit, pots arranged, ingredients prepared. The smell of frying food filled the air, drawing early customers once again. Her voice remained warm as she served each person, but something behind her eyes felt distant. She smiled when necessary, responded when spoken to, yet her mind often drifted elsewhere. A few customers commented on her quietness, asking if she was feeling well. Diana reassured them gently, insisting she was fine, but her truth remained unspoken, buried beneath routine. Meanwhile, David found himself once again near the outskirts of the village. The group of men under the tree had become more animated, speaking about leaving, working elsewhere, and rebuilding their lives. He stood at a distance, listening more closely than before. Their words no longer felt entirely foreign. They echoed something inside him he had not felt in a long time. For a brief moment, David considered stepping forward. The idea passed through him like a flicker of light, but almost immediately, doubt returned and pulled him back. He turned away, continuing his walk without direction. Each step felt like a decision he was not ready to make. The uncertainty followed him like a shadow. By midday, the sun grew harsh, pressing down on the village with unrelenting heat. Diana continued working, refusing to slow down despite her fatigue. Her strength remained, but it felt increasingly stretched. Another small disagreement broke out at the stall over change, briefly disrupting the flow of customers. Diana resolved it calmly, her voice firm but controlled. The moment passed, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion. As afternoon approached, dark clouds gathered again on the horizon. They moved slowly, heavy and uncertain, suggesting rain that never fully arrived. The village grew quieter as people retreated from the heat. Diana closed her stall earlier than usual and began her walk home. The path felt longer than ever, each step carrying the weight of thoughts she could not organize. Her mind returned again and again to David. When she arrived, David was already seated in his usual place. His posture was unchanged, but something in his presence felt even more distant. The silence between them now felt complete. Diana placed the food down and sat across from him without speaking. Neither moved to break the silence. It filled the room entirely, as if it had become another presence living with them. That night, as the wind moved softly through the village, both remained awake in separate worlds under the same roof. The distance between David and Diana was no longer growing slowly. It had already taken shape, quietly and unmistakably. The 9th morning arrived with a low, uncertain light spreading across the village. The sky was neither bright nor dark, but something in between, as if the day itself hesitated to fully begin. A quiet tension lingered in the air. David Okoye woke earlier than usual, though sleep had become little more than a distant habit. He sat in silence, staring at nothing in particular, as thoughts drifted through his mind without direction or clarity. Diana was already preparing for her day, moving through the small space with careful precision. Her routine remained unchanged, but her energy felt more restrained now, as if she was conserving strength for something unknown. The silence between them had become normal, yet it still felt heavy. It was no longer awkward or surprising. It was simply present, filling every corner of their shared space. Outside, the village was already alive with movement. Vendors called out from their stalls, children ran along dusty paths, and smoke rose steadily from early cooking fires. Life continued without hesitation. David stepped outside and paused at the doorway, looking down the familiar road. It no longer felt like it belonged to him, yet he still walked forward without knowing why. Diana watched him leave again, her expression calm, but her thoughts increasingly unsettled. She no longer expected conversation, only consistency in the growing silence. At her stall, she began preparing food as she always did. The fire crackled softly beneath the pot, and the scent of cooking filled the air, drawing familiar customers once again. Her voice remained warm and welcoming as she served each person, but her eyes carried a distant look. Something inside her had begun to shift quietly, though she could not yet explain it. A conversation between customers nearby caught her attention. They spoke about opportunities in another town, mentioning jobs, interviews, and people leaving for better lives. Diana listened silently while continuing her work. The words lingered in her mind longer than she expected. She pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the present, but they refused to fully disappear. Meanwhile, David found himself once again near the outskirts of the village. The group of men under the tree had grown louder and more confident in their discussions. They spoke about leaving soon, about change, about building something new elsewhere. Their voices carried a kind of certainty David had not felt in a long time. He stood at a distance, listening more closely than before. The idea of change no longer felt entirely impossible. For the first time, it felt like something that could be considered. But even as the thought formed, doubt followed immediately behind it. It wrapped around his mind, steady and familiar, pulling him back into hesitation. He turned away slowly, continuing his walk without destination. The road stretched ahead, but none of it felt like a path he was ready to take. By midday, the heat grew intense, pressing down on the village with relentless force. Diana continued working without pause, her movement steady despite growing fatigue. A brief disagreement occurred at the stall over pricing, breaking the flow of her routine for a moment. She resolved it calmly, her voice firm but controlled, before returning to work. As afternoon approached, dark clouds gathered once more in the distance. They moved slowly and heavily, hinting at rain that might never come. The village began to quiet as people sought shelter. Diana closed her stall earlier than usual and began walking home. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by thoughts she could no longer ignore. When she arrived, David was already seated in his usual place. His posture had not changed, but his presence felt further away than ever before. The silence between them felt final, though neither had spoken it aloud. Diana placed the food down and sat across from him without saying a word. The room filled with silence so complete it felt like another presence entirely. That night, under the same roof, they remained together but no longer truly connected. The 10th morning arrived with a strange heaviness in the air, as if the village itself was holding on to something unspoken. The sky was pale, stretched thin with scattered clouds that refused to settle into rain or sun. David Okoye woke earlier than usual, but there was no sense of rest in him. His eyes remained open long after sleep had left him, fixed on the ceiling as thoughts moved slowly through his mind. Diana was already preparing for the day, moving quietly through the small space they shared. Her routine had become almost mechanical now, yet there was still a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. The silence between them had deepened further. It was no longer something accidental or temporary. It had become a constant presence, shaping every moment they shared. Outside, the village continued its usual rhythm. Voices carried through the narrow paths, vendors called out to passing customers, and children ran freely under the early light. Life remained unchanged. David stepped outside without speaking, pausing for a moment at the doorway. The road ahead looked familiar, yet distant, as if belonging to someone else's memory rather than his own. Diana watched him leave again, her expression calm, but her thoughts heavier than before. She no longer searched for explanations. She simply observed the growing distance. At her stall, she prepared food with steady hands. The fire burned consistently beneath her pot, and the familiar aroma filled the air, drawing customers as it always had. Her voice remained polite and warm as she served each person, but her eyes carried a quiet exhaustion. Something inside her felt stretched, though she continued without complaint. A conversation nearby once again drifted into her awareness. People spoke about change, about leaving the village, about opportunities waiting elsewhere in ways that sounded almost unreal. Diana listened while continuing her work, the words settling quietly in her mind. She did not respond, but the idea of change lingered longer than she expected. Meanwhile, David found himself once more near the outskirts of the village. The group of men under the tree had become more organized in their conversations, speaking with growing certainty. They discussed plans to leave soon, to pursue work elsewhere, to rebuild their lives in a different place. Their confidence stood in sharp contrast to his hesitation. For the first time in days, David did not immediately turn away. He stood still, listening more carefully, allowing the possibility of change to exist without rejecting it instantly. But doubt remained close behind. It reminded him of everything uncertain, every failure, every reason to stay where he was, despite knowing something had to change. He eventually turned away, but slower than before. The hesitation lingered longer this time, following him even as he walked away from the group. By midday, the sun grew intense, pressing heavily over the village. Diana continued working through the heat, her movements steady but increasingly tired. Another minor disagreement occurred at her stall, quickly resolved as before. She handled it with calm authority, but the emotional weight of constant effort began to accumulate. As afternoon approached, dark clouds gathered again on the horizon, slow and uncertain. The village quieted as people retreated indoors, escaping the heavy air. Diana closed her stall earlier than usual and began walking home. Each step felt heavier, not from physical exhaustion alone, but from the growing emotional distance she could no longer ignore. When she arrived, David was already seated in his usual place. His presence was unchanged physically, but emotionally he felt further away than ever before. Diana placed the food down and sat across from him without speaking. The silence between them now felt complete, as if it had replaced conversation entirely. That night, as the wind moved gently through the village, both remained awake in separate silence. The distance between them was no longer growing. It had already become their new reality. The 11th morning arrived with a heavier silence than any before it. The sky was overcast, stretched in dull shades of grey that pressed low over the village. Even the wind felt hesitant, moving without direction. David Okoye woke with a sharp sense of unease he could not explain. It was not fear nor sadness, but something deeper, like a decision approaching him from a distance. Diana was already awake, sitting quietly for a moment before beginning her routine. She moved more slowly now, as if every action carried additional weight she could no longer ignore. The silence between them had become absolute. There were no more attempts to fill it, no more small gestures pretending things were normal. Only distance remained. Outside, the village continued its rhythm, but even that felt subdued. Voices were lower, movements slower, as if the world itself had adjusted to an unseen tension. David stepped outside and paused longer than usual at the doorway. The road ahead no longer felt familiar in any comforting way. It felt like something he was slowly drifting away from. Diana watched him go, but this time her gaze lingered after he disappeared. Something inside her tightened, a quiet realization forming that she had been avoiding. At her stall, she worked through the morning with steady hands. The fire burned as always, the food cooked as always, and customers came as always. But nothing felt the same. Her responses were polite, her smile practiced, yet her thoughts were elsewhere. She no longer needed distractions to notice the change. It was now impossible to ignore. A conversation nearby once again spoke of change and movement. People discussed leaving, rebuilding, and starting over in different places with better opportunities. Diana listened, but this time she did not push the thoughts away immediately. Instead, she allowed them to linger, unfamiliar and unsettling in their persistence. Meanwhile, David had returned to the outskirts where the men gathered. Their discussions had grown more serious, their plans more defined, their departure no longer just an idea but an approaching reality. He stood closer than before, no longer just observing from a distance. Their certainty surrounded him, filling the space where hesitation had always lived. For a brief moment, he imagined himself leaving, stepping into a different life, one not defined by stagnation or regret. The thought did not disappear immediately as it once had, but the weight of uncertainty returned quickly, anchoring him in place. He did not speak, but he also did not leave. He remained suspended between decision and fear. By midday, the heat felt suffocating despite the cloudy sky. Diana continued working, her strength still steady but increasingly strained by emotional exhaustion rather than physical labor. A small disruption at the stall broke her focus briefly, but she handled it without losing control. Yet afterward, she felt the fatigue settle deeper within her. As afternoon approached, the sky darkened further, though no rain came. The village grew quieter, almost expectant, as if waiting for something inevitable to occur. Diana closed her stall earlier than usual and began the walk home in silence. Each step carried a growing awareness that something within her life had reached its limit. When she arrived, David was already inside, seated as always. But this time, his posture felt different, less still, more inward, as if something had finally begun shifting inside him. Diana placed the food down, but neither of them moved immediately. The silence between them was no longer just absence. It felt like a threshold. That night, as the wind passed quietly through the village, both remained awake longer than usual. Something unspoken hovered between them. no longer distant or growing, but ready to break into reality at any moment. The 12th morning arrived quietly, without announcement or certainty. The sky was pale but open, as if the night had finally released its grip on the village. Yet beneath that calm surface, something irreversible was already in motion. David Okoye woke before dawn, but this time he did not sit in silence for long. Something inside him felt different, like a decision had already been made before he fully understood it. Diana was already awake, but she did not rush to begin her routine. Instead, she sat quietly for a moment, as if sensing that the air between them had changed in a way that could not be undone. The silence in the room no longer felt like distance. It felt like conclusion. Every unspoken word between them now carried final weight, no longer waiting for interpretation. Outside, the village moved as it always did, unaware of the turning point unfolding inside a small, ordinary home. Vendors called out, children ran, and life continued without pause or understanding. David stood slowly, his movements unusually calm. He looked at Diana for a long moment, not with anger, not with confusion, but with something closer to resignation. Diana met his gaze, and for the first time, she did not look away. There was no fear in her eyes anymore, only quiet awareness of what was coming. He spoke softly, his voice steady but final, as if the words had been waiting too long to be released. The life they had built, the promises they had shared, now felt like memories belonging to another time. Diana listened without interruption, her hands resting still in her lap. Each word landed heavily, but she no longer resisted them. Something inside her had already accepted what her heart had been avoiding. The room felt smaller than ever, not physically but emotionally, as if every breath carried the weight of ending. Neither of them moved to stop what was unfolding. Outside, the wind shifted gently through the village, brushing against roofs and trees with quiet indifference. Life continued, unaware that two people inside a small shack were reaching their final turning point. David finally turned away, no longer pacing between doubt and hesitation. His path had narrowed into something singular, though not yet fully understood. Diana rose slowly, not in anger or protest, but in quiet acceptance. There was no longer anything left to argue, only the reality of what had already been decided. A long silence followed, deeper than all previous silences combined. It was not empty. It was complete. It marked the end of something they once believed would last forever. As David stepped toward the door, he paused for only a brief moment, not to reconsider, but to acknowledge what was being left behind without return. Diana did not call out. She simply watched, her expression calm but layered with emotion too deep for words. In that moment, everything between them settled into finality. He left without looking back. The sound of his footsteps faded into the morning air, blending with the village noise until it disappeared completely. Diana remained standing in the quiet room, now fully aware that nothing would return to what it once was. The home still existed, the walls still stood, but its meaning had changed forever. Outside, life continued as it always had. But inside, the story of David and Diana had reached its final turning point. Not with noise or collapse, but with the quiet certainty of an ending that could no longer be avoided.